Hello, I'm Daniel, and during this presentation, Danny, Gabby, and I will be following up on our previous presentation on the basics of creative writing. And we will be going more in depth about specific genres of creative writing and showing an example.
Creative writing has different genres, as Daniel mentioned. Some may appeal to you and others not. It helps to try them all to see which one you feel the most confident writing in or have the most fun with. Here are a few of the principal ones, but genres are infinite, so feel free to find more on your own time and test them. We have our classic fiction story, meaning it is completely fake and you've made it all up. Creative nonfiction, meaning a decent portion of your story is based on a real event or person that you've expanded using your imagination and creative writing skills. Poetry is another specific form of creative writing where you use distinctive structure, style, and rhythm to express feelings and ideas. Shakespeare is a very famous poet you may know and be familiar with. Then there are screenplays, which are many people's favorites. They are the written form of movies, as all movies before they are filmed are written down on a script, which is what we mean by screenplay. You may find this a fun alternative to forms of writing that you don't love. Lastly, we have songs. Songs are pieces of creative writing that have rhythm, style, and structure like poetry does, but is accompanied by the use of sound and music, and often include some repetition as part of the structure. If you look at the lyrics of any song and read them out loud, I'm pretty sure you can see how similar it is to poetry, and you'll be able to see the creative expression that goes into writing them.
So, for fiction, when brainstorming your story idea, it is important to pay attention to the tone that you want to approach it with, along with your basic conflict and resolution. So, when setting the scene, it's important to include how the setting is important to the character, along with specific locations, for example, a country, state, a town, or even a building. When introducing your characters, it'll be helpful to include basic character traits, as well as a short story of the character, a short history of the character, for example, where they're from, how they got to this point, etc. And at some point during the storytelling process, after introducing the scene and characters, you'll need to define your central conflict. This could be a person, a group of people, or an event. While defining your central conflict, you should decide why the conflict is important to the character and how it affects them, and maybe how it affects even the people and environment around them as well. After figuring these main points of your writing out, it should be time to start.
So another popular type of creative writing is called creative nonfiction or historical fiction. In this genre, you can take a real event and then make it your own by transforming it into an event which seems almost fictional. Often, the characters you create will be based on real people, but you get to embellish them or change their personas. In this literary genre, the plot takes place in the past. The plot takes place in the past. Stories in historical fiction often capture the details of the time period as accurately as possible for authenticity, including social norms, manners, customs, and traditions. If you're writing about ancient history, you don't want the main character to be using a phone. The most important part of historical fiction stories is the setting. You need to choose a good, interesting historical event before you start writing and make sure you know a lot about it. The plot in a historical fiction novel is a combination of real events and fictional events. You can invent characters, cities, and events, but you need to make sure that they fit your time period. One popular example of creative nonfiction is choose your own adventure books. These books often start out with the reader in a real scenario in history, but then they add fictional elements and allow the reader to decide how the story ends.
As mentioned before, poems or poetry is a form of literary work that has a concrete style, structure, and rhythm and expresses feelings and ideas through story. I'm sure you've heard some in your life, but it might help to search up a few poems to familiarize yourself with what they are. Poetry varies in size, so they can be as long or short as you want them to be. You can write pages worth of poetry, or if you're running low on time, you may have just 3 lines, and that is still as valid. Poetry usually uses a lot of literary devices such as imagery and metaphors to vividly paint a picture. They also have rhyme and rhythm to make the poem have a flow and to give it life that other literary works might not have. It also tells you how to read the poem, an example of which being the very famous iambic pentameter. Beyond their content, poems also have structure that defines them. You can stick to structures already outlined, like a haiku or a sonnet or an acrostic poem, or freely write poetry in your own style and structure that you make. Structures determine how many lines per section you have and how your poems may sound, so choose wisely.
So when writing a screenplay, you should introduce the setting first. When doing so, you should be specific by stating the building the story starts in, such as a house and the time of day, etc. In order to move past the introductory aspect of your screenplay, because there's a possible visual component to the story, such as being on a movie or TV screen, that would mean that dialogue of characters and their actions can be used to move the story forward more quickly than if you were to use third person narrate. During the scenes with dialogue, it's important to describe the scene to the reader, usually as parentheticals, which are basically stage directions, so that your vision can be realized more easily. What's cool about screenplays is that because of the dialogue, you can have two different characters with their own storylines in different scenes. So being comfortable with the density of your plot, because that's what makes it unique to you.
Believe it or not, songs are based off of creative writing too. Creativity in song lyrics is very closely linked to poetry due to the necessity of rhyme and rhythm in songs. And the addition adds an extra element. The addition of sound adds an extra element, which allows for the writing to be portrayed in many different ways. Songs are often about something personal the writer has experienced, but can also be written about the experience of others or of the world around them. Songs can start off with an anecdote, with a historical event, or with a completely fictional story. One way that many people compose songs is by starting off with a poem and then transforming that poem into lyrics. They then focus on the rhythm of the words and the sounds of the music. The most important part of that composition is the first step, which is primarily based in creative writing. Here is one example of creative writing in a poem. I made some slime yesterday and put it in a jar. Today, when I went to look, I saw something bizarre. My slime was moving up the side and trying to escape. I closed the lid really tight and covered it with tape. This poem starts out with a silly sentence and follows a similar pattern throughout. While creative writing can often take a serious tone, a light tone like the one shown here works too. The rhythm of the poem, which is primarily dictated by the rhymes at the end of every line, seem light too, similar to the topic of the poem. Now we will show you some exercises to help you use creative writing to make your composition similar to this.
To conclude our presentation, we want you to try this exercise. Write a story, poem, or song, starting with one of the sentences listed, and refer back to all that we've discussed to hone your creative writing skills.